just by way of introduction for those of you who don't know David, David MacDougall is a documentary filmmaker and writer on cinema. He was educated at Harvard University and the University of California at Los Angeles. His first feature-length film, which was called To Live with Herds, was filmed in Uganda and won the Grand Prix Venezia Genti at the Venice Film Festival in 1972. Soon after this, David and his wife Judith MacDougall produced the Turkana Conversations trilogy of films on semi-nomadic camel herders of northwestern Kenya. Really, really out there. There were numerous prizes. I certainly won't go into them because they run quite a few pages. Coming back to Australia, when David moved to Australia, he was, from 1975 to 1991, David was director of the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, AFTRS.
Film unit. The film unit, not the
film
institute.
unit, right, okay, thanks for that. With Judith MacDougall, he co-directed a number of films on Indigenous communities in Australia, and then in 1991 there was a film on photographic practices in an Indian hill town called Photo Wallers. So many things, films on goat herders, various things which I can't go into too much detail, but bring us to tonight's films. In 1997, David began conducting a film study of the Doon School in northern India, resulted in 5 films. Gandhi's Children 2008 was awarded the grand prize at the 2009 AFTRS Film Festival, was nominated for Best Documentary Feature Film at the 2009 Asia Pacific Film Awards. And David is currently conducting a series of video workshops with varied groups of children in India, which have so far resulted in several films being produced. And David also writes regularly on documentary and ethnographic cinema and is the author of Transcultural Cinema, 1998, and The Corporeal Image, Film, Ethnography and the Senses, 2006. He's presently adjunct professor at the Research School of Humanities and the Arts at ANU. So we're very honoured and pleased to have you here tonight, David. I thought I'd... Yeah.
Well, I've heard a lot about this group, not too long ago, but fairly recently, and I understand you're a friendly and sympathetic group.
Passionate.
Passionate about cinema, about documentary, so it's a pleasure to finally catch up with you.
And to have you here at last. I thought I'd just start off by asking you a little bit about it in our chat before we were discussing the idea of ethnographic film, anthropological film, and where that sits in the broader spectrum of documentary filmmaking. So could you give me a perspective on how you see that and where your practice fits in?
Well, I see ethnographic film as just a subset of documentary, although it doesn't even have to be documentary. There have been fiction films that you might consider ethnographic films, but for me, an ethnographic film is any film that has the intention of looking at cultural patterns in society. And so it comes at it from that perspective, but it doesn't have to be made by an anthropologist. It simply has to have an interest in ethnography, broadly speaking, and understanding how societies work. And of course, there's a huge overlap with what documentary filmmakers do. You know, one of the sort of foundation stones of anthropological research is field work, where people go and spend up to a year, 2 years with the people that they're studying. And I think in the practice of many documentary filmmakers, that's the ideal, at least. You may not have that much time, but so there is that kind of sort of overlap of practice, I think. But I have a very hard time defining really which of my films would be considered ethnographic and which are simply some form of social documentary.
So you don't see it as a separate strand in a way. There's quite a bit of overlap.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Now you work at ANU. A lot of us struggle for funding for our films, and continue to struggle because we tend to want to have them seen on television. Do you feel, are you freed from that burden of having to please the commissioning editors, or have you crossed over into that line at different times in your career?
Well, I have made some films for television, but rather few. Most of my films have been made on the basis of funding from foundation grants or fellowships. And then really since the advent of digital video, which has made a huge difference, I imagine, to all of us, it's been possible for me to continue making films on fairly small academic research budgets. And in a way, that's what's made it possible to continue working fairly independently.
So when you have worked for television, have you pitched to them? Have they come to you and said that we would like you, because of your expertise in films about camel herders in Kenya,
Yeah.
we just can't wait to get a reality series going on?
No, it hasn't been that way at all. No, I mean, I think I've been lucky in the commissioning editors, and there are very few that I've dealt with at Arte, for example, where I sent them a cut of the film, which was actually, it had been mixed already, it was finished. And they came back and said, this is fine, but we think, you know, you should make this change and that change. And I had to write back and say, well, sorry, it's too late. And the other occasion really that I can remember quite vividly is that I'd been asked by the Ethnographic Institute in Sardinia to make a film about the life of shepherds. And I had a reasonable budget from them. This was a 16mm production. But I felt that if I were going to spend sufficient time to get to know my subject, I really needed a bigger budget. And so it just happened that the BBC was starting a new series of feature-length documentaries, 90-minute slots. And Andre Singer was the commissioning editor, and I was in London. I just walked into his office and explained the situation and said, is there any possibility of getting some BBC funding? And he sort of brought out a sheet of paper and he said, well, we have one more slot, so I'll just pencil you in there.
Nice.
And 15 minutes later, I walked out, you know, with essentially doubled the budget. And it will never happen again, I can assure you.
We've all had that experience, haven't we? Yeah.
Could it happen today?
Who knows? I mean, I haven't had to pursue that route, I guess. Other people, well, Rod, you'd be in a much better position to say. It depends.
It's very uphill.
It's all a matter of circumstance, I think. If you happen to hit a particular opening, you can go for it. But otherwise, you can, you know, beat your head against the wall.
Let's just talk about, you mentioned that was a 90-minute slot. For example, Gandhi's Children, which we'll see an excerpt of tonight, is 3 hours. I would imagine that most of your ethnographic films certainly don't fit inside the television, 56 minutes or I mean, there's almost no feature-length slots for Australian documentaries anyway. So Who are your audiences?
I think it's a mistake always to try to predict exactly what your audience will be. I know that it's a kind of part of the rubrics and rhetoric of filmmaking that you should look for your target audience, have a target audience in mind. But I've just seen so often that people from very different walks of life, very different backgrounds can respond to the same film if it's good enough. And they may see a different film. You know, each of them may see the film quite differently and draw different things from it. But if it's sufficiently rich, sufficiently well made, then the potential audiences are quite broad. And furthermore, as time goes on, we don't know who will be interested in these films 50 years from now. You know, it could be a completely different context in which people find them worth watching. So my audiences have, partly the answer is I don't know. You know, I don't know really, in a sense, who see these films. I know that they're distributed for universities a lot. They are shown at festivals when I can manage to find time to enter them in festivals, which is a kind of laborious process of, you know, filling out the entry forms, sending the DVD copies and all that. But for example, one of the films that I made in India, well, a group of films I made about this traditional boarding school in India called the Dune School. I think the potential audiences for that would be quite broad, because you could have people interested in schools or institutions or child psychology or post-colonial studies or India broadly, Indian society. So there maybe you could say there are a whole lot of niche audiences that are potentially interested in your film.
Well, let's take that as an example. How did that come about? You didn't, if you're not even, I mean, it's a wonderful freedom. I can't, almost unimaginable to not have to first think, because one of the things you have to fill out on the funding applications is, you know, what's your marketing plan, who's your target audience, is this, and of course we always write primetime television because you want to aim up there. Who wouldn't? But when you go into a project like that, you're free, you seem to be freed from that constraint. You're just saying the subject is what is at the heart of it, and audiences will come. Is that too simple?
Yeah, I guess I make a kind of, maybe a kind of arrogant assumption that if something interests me enough, there'll be a few other people at least who may be interested. And obviously if I'm interested in it and engage in it with some passion, not simply as a job, that enhances that possibility. So, you know, the Dune School project was, I got into it almost by accident. An Indian anthropologist contacted me who was doing his PhD on 3 schools of northern India, and he said, "Do you think there's some potential for documentary filmmaking in this subject?" And that led me into approaching the school, getting permission to film there. But I didn't know what would come out of it. Initially, I proposed it to ABC and BBC, and there was some interest, but that fell through because they said nobody's interested in this sort of subject. And then...
Heard that one before?
Yeah, I mean, the commissioning editor at BBC said, this has been tried before, but it never really works. That was his email to me, or fax. So then, when I began, I didn't know if I would be making one film or a series of short films. I had no idea, and it really developed organically from the first film to the second, to the third, to the fourth, to the fifth, and I ended up with 5 films, each of which sort of grew out of the preceding ones. And that was over a period of 5 years or so.
We'll have plenty of time for questions afterwards, but I just thought let's lead. You started making those films, so you were the filmmaker for the Dune School.
Yes.
Could you just sort of make a bridge into this project that you're working on now, where you're not the filmmaker, you're more of a, or how would you describe your role in this latest series of films made by kids in a school?
Well, actually, I can make a bridge into both things I want to show you tonight, because first of all, the Dune School project led me to a second project in a totally different type of school in India, a progressive, experimental, co-ed school. But both of these had been middle-class schools. And then I wanted to find a very different type of institution for children as a kind of third area of study, comparatively. And that led me into this orphanage and juvenile detention center, where I made my third sort of long-term project. And through all of these three projects, I had been doing small projects, video workshops in some cases, with kids in the school. And sometimes I would say, if you have an idea, come to me and we'll see what we can develop, what we can make of that. So, for example, at the second school I was at, a boy came and said, I'd like to use video to study how the way people walk might be an indicator or a symptom of their emotional state, their moods at that moment.
Sounds like a PhD thesis.
Yeah, and he was 10 years old, this boy. So I taught him to use the camera. He went out and shot, many examples of people walking. He then made his analysis. He showed it to other people and got their analysis to see if there was any agreement, and so on. So that was one of these small projects that led me to the idea of proposing to the Australian Australian Research Council to fund a series of video workshops for different groups of children around India from very different backgrounds, some urban, some rural, some middle class, some from poor families. And we've been doing that now for the last 3 years. We've done 4 of these video workshops. And the films that come out of them, I think, are often quite extraordinary. The kids are between 10 and 13, at a very interesting period in their lives, I think, where they're quite experimental. And so the films that have resulted have been quite varied. We don't present it to them as just a sort of play activity. We actually ask them to choose topics that are important to them. We teach them the rudiments of handling a video camera, and we ask them to use the video camera as a research tool, essentially to explore the topic that they've chosen. And then that results finally in a kind of video report, or you could call it a film, which comes out of that research. So the first thing I wanted to show you was one of these films from a project in Delhi. I think it was shot in early last year, 2012. And it's we've sort of put it into a kind of portmanteau film that includes 4 of the films from this workshop, with a bit of contextual material about who the kids are, called Delhi at 11, because as it happened, all the kids were 11 years old.
Great. Well, let's have a look at that. Any questions or observations or about this project or about anything else at this stage?
Just a quick question about the editing process. Like, how were the kids involved in that?
Yeah, we did a rough edit in Delhi right after the shooting, and And then I brought the material back and did some final editing and put the English subtitles on, and then took it back to India, and the kids made some final changes at that point, and then we locked it down like that. But in fact, in the case of this film in particular, a lot of it was edited in the camera. So there are quite long stretches of it that are more or less intact footage, just edited as he saw it, really.
Jane? Yeah.
I was interested in how they were given some form of structure or limits, or was it simply just go out and do what you want, and how much footage were they able to shoot, and you know, those sorts of things?
Yeah.
Because obviously if it was too open, it might be.
Yeah, I mean, they were, in theory, they were restricted to the topic they had chosen. But in Aniket's case, it was pretty vague. So it ended up being sort of everything about home.
He's clearly going to be an observational filmmaker when he grows up.
And yeah, so there, and I made a point of not showing them any films because I didn't want to sort of set models for them to copy. So a lot of it comes out of their experience of Indian media, television, Bollywood films, so on. And you can see the kind of impact of, you know, technology on this family. I mean, it's there on the radio and television, mobile phones are everywhere. It's quite continuous and all around you. So you asked about how much material. They didn't shoot a lot, in fact. I think for this film, maybe it was like maybe 3 hours of material in all. Or maybe even less, over about 6 weeks. Yeah.
So was this done when you say 6 weeks, it was a lesson? They would show up and do a bit of filmmaking one day, you know, for a couple of hours, and then next week and the next week, or was it more intense than that?
Well, the first week was a bit more intensive, just sort of showing them how to work the cameras, but they were very quick to get on to that. And then I would meet them almost every day for about an hour at the school. I was never with them when they were shooting, so I only saw what they brought back each day to show what they had done the day before. And that's the way it went. You know, it's a child's view in a sense. It's how many adults would sing while they were shooting? You know, it's a quite a different, it was full of surprises for me. And I've shown it to quite a number of people who are interested, particularly in India, and they say that it gives a more vivid sense of Indian domestic life than they've seen in films made by adults, because it's really all around you. It's very dense material in a sense, and the fact that they live in these very small spaces, I think, comes through. The impact of public media and technology is very strong. So different people will see different things in this material. And then there's the whole sort of surreal aspect of this film in particular, which sort of appealed to me. Especially this ending, which Aniket was determined that should be the end of the film, him singing, you know. And he had been shooting himself, and it seemed almost going to sleep, you know. He was very drowsy when he was shooting that, I think. So it's very strange.
It looks like a Satyajit Ray film, but in color to me.
I don't know what Ray would say, but...
If only he'd had a digital camera. Who knows what he would have done. Okay, well let's, I'd prefer to sort of prioritise the screenings and then talk about the practice afterwards. So, I mean, I could read the introduction to Gandhi's Children, but perhaps it's better if it comes from you. Could you set the context for this?
Well, as I said before, this was the third of three fairly major projects looking at institutions for children in India. And this was shot over a couple of months, during which I lived in the home. It's a home run by an NGO, but it functions as several things. First, as an orphanage, because a lot of the kids are there as orphans. Others are there because they've been picked up off the streets for petty crimes and or just street kids who've wandered in or been brought in. And but it also functions as a juvenile detention center. So about half the children are there under a magistrate's order, and they have to stay a certain period of time. You know, my objectives really were to look at this as an institution, first of all, in comparison to the two schools where I'd spent a lot of time. But then, and this is one of the reasons it's a very long film, because in addition to that, I wanted to find out the stories of a number of these kids, how they ended up in a place like this. What was their reaction to being there? And because some of them were quite content, others were very distressed for all sorts of reasons. And so the film progresses through a series of portraits of individual children, of which you won't see much, perhaps only one or two examples in the first part that I'll show you. So don't feel you've seen this film. Unfortunately, we can't see it all, but it does develop through a number of different characters who start recurring and more or less converge toward the end of the film. Mm-hmm. Although some drop out, as happens in this place. Kids just run away and disappear suddenly.
David, did you go into this with any kind of approach? Was it with any kind of advocacy that you wanted the film to have some kind of impact or result? Did you, or was it just very open-ended for you?
No, I did have one objective. Well, aside from my main objective, which was really to try to show what it was like for children growing up in an institution like that, what was their experience of the place, both in physical terms, just the physical environment of a place that's quite intimidating, really, and then in terms of their personal relations and so on. But I kind of had a secondary aim, which was to create a kind of report for the NGO that ran the home. Mm-hmm. Because in general, the people in the higher echelons of the NGO, and it's quite a big and important one in Delhi with a lot of connections and pretty well funded, they really don't have any idea what goes on in these homes that they operate. And if they come there, they might come once a year and the kids will put on a little song and dance performance for them and then they'll go away. So they don't really get a sense of what the grind of daily life is like. And so the secondary aim was really to show them what it's like there. And if that would have some benefits, you know, I hoped it would. Because it's not a very well-run institution, as you'll see. It's, everything's breaking down, it's inefficient, there's very little contact between the staff and the children. So one hopes that, you know, it might have some direct effect like that, but then it's also various activists in India have found it useful for discussing questions like child labor, which there have been a lot of very simplistic solutions to the problems of child labor, but in fact it's incredibly complex when children are contributing substantial support for their families when they have no alternatives, when they are involved in various trades, and they're obviously exploited a lot of the time, but there's another side to it. So that sort of question, I think the film raises that. It also raises the whole question of the industry of NGOs, you know, of which there are thousands in India, good, bad, and indifferent. And a lot of people are employed in these NGOs, and they get a lot of money from both from, say, Indian industry, but also a lot from foreign sources, donations and grants. And it's really a topic of quite great interest in India now, to discuss the role of these non-government organizations, the extent to which they are a replacement for things that governments should actually be doing, the extent to which they're exploitative. Do they make a difference? All these questions are discussed a lot. So we
Okay.
might go and
Well, rich topics for discussion about the filmmaking and also the impact and place of the film. Thanks, Bob. I think the thing that really struck me was just the joy of seeing a film which was just so, the shots were just there. I don't know if anyone's seen Discovery Channel recently, but there seems to be a law against having a shot which is more than 2 seconds long. It's just so disturbing. It feels as if you got whiplash, and it was just, I feel as if I've really spent some time there, something to do with the pace of it. Would you like to comment about that, of how you work with the material?
Well, I have a friend who said he'd prefer if all the shots were twice as long, but I don't go quite that far. I think it's all a matter of your sense of rhythm and pace and the requirements of the moment in the film, the way you place emphasis here or there, or simply allow something to unfold in a way that's comprehensible and that brings you somehow close to the experience. I mean, it's all about, in a sense, creating an experience for the audience, which is obviously not their experience, a little bit more like my experience being there, and but in a way that you can sort of intuit other people's emotional and physical life, you know, how they are at any given moment.
It was very moving. I'll just throw it open to anybody who wants to engage in conversation with David. Tom.
You must have a very steady hand, or you use a tripod a lot. The other question is more in terms of the style of it. Obviously, the stories of the kids emerged gradually through the film, and obviously this was intentional. Yeah. Is this how the next 2 hours unfold? Do you get to know these same kids or other kids?
Then you're introduced to children who are very different from the ones you've seen here. So that's part of the reason that the film is so long, that it becomes a series of portraits. And some of them are much more resilient, and some of them are quite confident. For example, we follow this boy, John, through the whole film. And he's incredibly self-sufficient, self-reliant. At one point, there's quite a joyful conversation with him where he says, I have no problems in Delhi. In Delhi, you can find anything you want, food, shelter, as much money as you need. If I feel like traveling, I get on a train and just go where it takes me. You know, I've been all over. And that's sort of, so there's quite a variety in responses of the kids.
The film never leaves the institution, essentially.
Sorry?
It never leaves the building.
Only that part at the beginning of the film where you see the neighborhood a bit, get a sense of how it's placed. But beyond that, no, you don't. When they go off to the court, we just see them being taken on a bus to court, and then they come back. So the technical question, I mean, I hate tripods. So a lot of it is handheld. And then I do have a little thing called a travel pod. It's about that high, and it folds up, so you can just clip it onto the bottom of the camera or screw it in to the tripod receptacle there. And if you need to use it, you can just unfold it and rest it on your knee, for example, or on the ground. I've found it very, very useful. But I also think you have to learn how to handhold steadily. And it's a skill that anybody can learn, but a lot of people don't bother, it seems to me. It's one of the first things we teach our students is just learn to hold the camera steady and look at something, Stop waving it around and just look.
It was Tony Wilson who said director is something for the tripod is something for the director to carry around. Martha?
Going back to, I remember Sunny in the Dark Horse and that Sardinia film, and it seems as if you just find the right spot and then you watch. But of course, I remember To Live with Herds, you were sort of set up and people did these things, but can you talk about, I don't know if there's anything you can say, maybe it's only instinct, but just finding that spot where you need to be.
It's partly a matter of experience, as you make more films, you learn. You walk into a room and you sort of automatically have a sense of where you should be in relation to the people that you're interested in. So it's sort of trying to find that optimum position in which you won't find yourself sort of painted into a corner by having chosen the wrong position. The best position from which you think you can see what's going to unfold.
And then you don't seem to move much.
And, well, sometimes you have to move, of course, or you may be following somebody. And another thing is often, again, with students, they get themselves into this position where two people are talking, right? And they're facing each other. And they place themselves just opposite that. And then the people start backing up, and going out of the edges of the frame. And then they don't know what to do, Do you follow one of them or the other? It's like a ping pong match. And so trying to find a kind of oblique position where you can see two people, one closer to the camera, one farther away. That sort of thinking, about where to be, to make sense of it.
But of course you wouldn't think, would you?
Well, it becomes instinctive after a while to say, you don't sort of think consciously, where should I be? You just go there.
Mitzi?
My question's about access. How you negotiated access, how long you were there before you started filming, how long you were there overall to film the whole 3 hours?
It took about 5 years to get permission because I'd heard about this NGO, and I made a kind of an initial contact with them, and then they were very bad at replying to letters or emails. And so whenever I was in Delhi, I'd go and see them in their main office. And meanwhile, I was doing these other projects. And eventually, we worked out an agreement that they'd let me live in the home. And I told them quite frankly that this was part of a project in which I was studying institutions. So that was my brief. And then I agreed to conduct a video workshop with some of the kids in the home. And I actually trained five of the boys, and they ended up making a film. It's about a 25-minute long film. And that was the quid pro quo. But then in a way, what the kids were filming was a very useful guide to me about what I should film and how I should look at things. And so it had a lot of benefit for me as well. And I lived in they gave me a room in there, in the building, and then I worked very closely with an Indian graduate student from Delhi University he didn't actually live there as I did, but he would come every day and spend a few hours with me. And that's how you get these conversations, because I was having to speak through him, essentially. But he understood absolutely what I was interested in. You know, our thinking was very close. And he was a marvelous, you know, collaborator and assistant.
And how long overall were you there, David?
I lived there 2 months, which for me is rather short. I mean, it's a rather short time, but that's how it worked out.
Randall?
I was going to ask what the impact of the film was in India itself, up the screen there.
Yeah, it's. I've shown it to different kinds of audiences. For example, I showed it to year 11 students in a middle-class school. And they were quite shocked and at the same time quite positive about it, because they said, we just don't have contact with this kind of thing in our lives. We're very compartmentalized, and we're really glad you made the film. And it's also been used a bit by various activist groups, and it's been shown at a film festival in India, more as cinema than as specifically a sort of film of advocacy of any sort. So it's had different audiences. I expected a big backlash against the film from middle-class viewers in India, because, first of all, here's this foreigner coming in. There's always a lot of resentment, I think, about filming of poverty or social problems, especially by outsiders. As if you're slumming, you know, you're coming from the West to sort of sensationalize their problems. But I haven't actually had that response. I expected it, but I haven't. Fortunately, it seems that people can get into the film enough so that they see that it goes a bit beyond that kind of stereotype.
Okay. Jane, and then Bob.
If one was to attempt something like that here, you would have to get releases from every child or every person that appeared, and of course that makes things extremely difficult to do here of that anything along those lines. So what's the situation there regarding that?
Well, it was a bit odd because, in a sense, all those kids are wards of the state. And by giving me permission, the institution was acting as their guardian, in effect. So, I mean, if you wanted to look at it from a sort of legalistic basis. But I think you could never make a film like that here. There'd be no way in that case either that you could get releases.
No.
In India. And, you know, that's the trade-off in a way. It's, but I think, I mean, one experience that I've always had in India is that people seem very open to being filmed or photographed. In fact, when we were shooting this film, Photowalas, years ago, in a hill station, people would constantly come up to us and say, "Can I be in the film?" or can you take my picture? And we'd explain, well, you know, it's not a still camera and we can't give you back a copy. And they said, it doesn't matter, just like to be in it. And that's so very different from situations in which people maybe feel that you're somehow stealing their soul, taking something away from them. It's almost as if in India there's a sense of photography adding something, you know, another manifestation to who you are. The more images, the better. And I sort of like to relate that to the idea of the many ways in which the gods are portrayed, and, you know, proliferation of deities. But, and so for a filmmaker, that's obviously a very welcome situation to be in. Very rarely have I ever had anybody say no, you know. It's often, much more often the opposite.
That extreme sensitivity that the official India displayed after the Louis Malle series.
And after Forest of Bliss of Bob Gardner.
That's all gone then, obviously. I mean, it's pretty open. You can just go in. As long as you get the specific institutional green light, you're okay. There's no sort of, like, you know, you have to sort of lodge the film with the authorities before you could leave the country almost before. That's all gone then.
That used to be the case. I mean, when we were going to make Photowalas, we were told we'd have to have a minder always with us. We'd have to present them before we started shooting with a complete script, what we would be shooting every day, where we would be. We said, obviously, that isn't the kind of film that we're making. We don't know how it will be. And unfortunately, somebody in the ministry involved said, yeah, we understand, and we won't require that. We'll waive all those requirements. But things like equipment, importing 16mm gear into India was a nightmare. You know, it was, every item had to be listed and signed for, you know, 20 times, going in and coming out. Every battery that you used, you couldn't throw it away because you had to account for it. So we had to keep all our spent batteries so they could be counted up on export. But that has all changed with digital video. And also a lot of the government regulation has changed because it's impossible to control.
What was that water coming out of those outlets?
Yeah, I mean, all these drains come into this pumping station and are sort of filtered. Some of the garbage and the rags and all that's filtered out, roughly, and then it's pumped out into that open field. And that was outside my window. So, and it ran for about 10 hours a day. You could more or less set your watch by.
And why only one pipe?
Well, they had 4 pipes, but then they used them sort of serially. I don't know how they chose. Whichever pump was meant to be used that day, I guess.
Did it absolutely stink?
Sorry?
Did it stink?
If the wind was in the wrong direction, but it wasn't so bad. Yeah. But everybody hated it. I mean, there were constant complaints by all the people who lived around there and by Prayas, and the boys hated it as well. I took a copy of it to the manager of the NGO, and we sat down and I played it back to him on a laptop. And every 30 seconds he had a phone call on his mobile. So it was like, you know, he was sort of paying a little bit of attention, but most of the time he was talking to other people. And at the end he said, well, you know, it's obviously shows some of the problems, but he wasn't particularly negative. And I sent them copies then, which I think they just filed away somewhere. And then later on, it had begun to be shown a bit around. And Prayas had got a new sort of publicity agent on staff. And he wrote to me and he said, "We think that this film, it would be best if you didn't show this film widely." Something like that. He said, because it puts our boys in a bad light. So I wrote back immediately and I said, "Don't worry. Everybody I've shown to thinks the boys are wonderful. And there's no problem about that at all." And and I never heard back anything further from him. And then it went into festivals in Europe and was shown around.
Can I ask what's been a follow-up then since then? I mean,
Not a word. I mean, another thing is I wrote a sort of 20-page written report on my observations and a set of sort of polite recommendations for things I could see they could improve and things I thought they did well, things I thought that needed work, and they never acknowledged it. I think it's just one more thing that got filed. But I felt a certain obligation to do that in addition to the film. I have stayed in touch with a few of the kids, and one of them is now, he's actually in his first year in college. We've sort of helped him. You see him a little bit in this first hour, but he's more prominent later in the film. Very bright, really wanted to study, but felt because he was a court walla, he wasn't allowed out to the school. So we've been able to help him get through that part of his education, and we're hoping he does well in the future.
Okay, Tina?
I was going to ask you about school and whether they actually go to school and if you actually can show that in the film at all.
The schooling, it was very bizarre because half the kids were there under a court order, so they were called court wallas, and they were forbidden to leave the building, or that cluster of buildings. The other half, the home wallas, as they were called, were allowed to go out to the local primary school. So every day they'd go out in the morning and they'd come back in the afternoon. And you do see a bit of them coming and going, but I don't actually follow them to the school, which, as it turns out, was a very badly run government primary school. They weren't learning much at all. And they had a sort of what they called informal classes in the building, which the court wallas could go to. But again, they weren't learning much. It was more sort of minding them, you know.
No industrial training or anything?
They were doing some vocational training, yeah, teaching them. Some of it was sort of token, like they had a few computers, but so some of them were trying to learn computer skills. Others were learning carpentry, a little bit of electrical work. But very bizarrely, these kids who had been released from the embroidery factory, well, they were teaching kids embroidery. So, and the kids knew much more embroidery than they did. I mean, they knew all about it.
We'll need to wind it up. I just want to mention that amongst many other things, David's recently received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Royal Anthropological Institute. And just reminded me, I was at a function in the States somewhere where someone mentioned that a fellow actor had received a Lifetime Achievement Award, and he said, "Oh, I didn't know he was ill." But David tells me he's in fine health, and he regards it as a mid-career award rather than a Lifetime Achievement. So can we all thank David?